can determine the rules for dispute resolution for all other courts or forums in this case. So Amsterdam, they have created their own constitution. This link I put up in the chat is just their spreadsheet that has the version 1 and version 2 shown side by side. It doesn't include their version 3 from EOS Amsterdam. They linked that about a couple days ago, I think. Let me see if I can find it. I'll pull that link up too. Does that answer your question there, Perry?
It does. Thank you very much. I have, if I could just kind of broaden the conversation just briefly, if that's all right. It doesn't look like we have a hard and fast agenda today.
Yeah, go ahead.
But maybe you could help me understand what Block 1's plans are. They have a constitution. I've read it. I've got it here in my browser. We've all read it. Is that their final word, or is that just kind of like, you know, this is what we did, this is what we proposed a few weeks ago, and you know, obviously you don't work for Block 1, but do you have any insight as to where they're going, or do they, or that version is, that's it, that's what they want? Seems like it,
yeah. And we've actually seen Dan sort of back it up in Twitter, not necessarily specifically the Constitution, but he responded to Vitalik a few days ago about burning the worker proposal system. And actually, I don't remember him talking about getting rid of the arbitration layer that like he has been a proponent for. But as far as I know and can tell, it looks like that is their final stand. And may have even been pushing the limits a little bit as to what they would like to get involved in, as they call us just a public blockchain of EOSIO software. So,
okay, so
go ahead.
They're still hands off on governance for the most part.
Yes, I think we've probably heard the final word from them, from my own estimation. Yeah.
Well, for this, my feelings on all the things that are happening recently are, you know, super positive to see all the engagement and meetings. It's awesome. I think that EOS is doing that. But I also see a lot of, you know, there's just a lot of ideas. And obviously, we've all got our own ideas, and that's healthy. That's a good, you know, that's good for the early stages. What I think might be helpful is to kind of divide up the problem a little bit. And I think the first stage of the problem, in my mind, I see it as trying to come to some agreement, or at least put the question out there for everybody's awareness. What is the scope what is the scope of the Constitution? And once we get that, or in combination with that, what are our values? In other words, when I say scope, are we trying to decide, and I think I brought this up briefly before, and I'll just repeat it now quickly. Are we trying to decide every little aspect that would be arbitrated? Are we trying to decide, for example, you know, if a package was delivered to somebody's porch, somebody's front of their house or not? You know, if that becomes a dispute in an arbitration, are we trying to set the rules for that? That would normally be the purview of an application, for example, in the case of eBay or Amazon. Or are we trying to define the base layer? That's one. And then what are our values? What are our values? Are we, in terms of this Constitution, right? What are we actually trying to achieve? Do we value trying to maintain scalability? Do we value trying to capture every possible instance? What are the goals and the reflected values of the Constitution themselves? I think if people can get an agreement, or at least an understanding as to what we're trying to do, then things can then we can start to take, a Constitution can start to take shape. But I kind of hear people that are talking through each other or past each other because they really don't have the same conception of scope or values. That's what I wanted to say. So my particular take on that, on scope and values, is that the scope should be for this particular Constitution should be to the base layer, It should not involve things. We should push as much as we possibly can to the DApp layers. And that's not being irresponsible or lazy. That's actually for the benefit of the system. Keeping the base layer as absolutely simple as possible, just like we keep HTTP, the protocol HTTP, as simple as we possibly can. Of course, we want to add features, but we try to keep it as simple as possible. I think that's an important, that's a very important. Uh, so let's keep the scope of it to the base layer. And then, what do we value? Uh, we value, or I value, the ability for this thing to run as smoothly as possible. And I don't necessarily value particular judgment calls. I do see the wisdom in what Dan and Block One have proposed, or at least in my perception of what I think that they've proposed, which is just absolutely minimize as much as possible any kind of subjectivity, uh, and try to keep it as tight as possible. I think if we do that, if we create a constitution that is as tight as possible and is limited to the scope of the base layer, then the dApps can create their own constitutions, right? Each one can have their own constitution, and they can make it as concocted, convoluted as they want, and the free market will decide whether their constitution reflects their users. Uh, their users will decide if they want to join those dApps based on their constitution, and so that's what I think is. That's what I want to put out there into the EOS universe.
And it looks like Justin in the chat agreed with you 100%, he says.
All right. Okay.
Anything else you'd like to add, Justin? If you
Hey, how you doing?
Hey, good.
No, Perry actually summarized my views up like exactly. So I don't have a lot to add to that. I think the base layer is all about development of dApps. And as long as it allows the developers to do that, I don't feel like there needs to be too much of a constitutional layer there. So it should be, I think looking through at what the version 2 that Block 1 or Dan has suggested, I don't see any major issues with that. So I'm not sure what the refuting arguments are for having a more detailed kind of layer. I'd be interested in hearing what those are.
I think the main point, and it sounds, to sort of summarize what I'm hearing from Perry as well, and from Justin, to that matter, sounds like we're hearing scalability is the most important thing for you guys. Just having a base layer protocol that can handle as many dApps as possible. We don't want any kind of body being weighed down, any kind of arbitration body weighed down by all these cases and issues. The main argument against the version 2 proposal from Block 1 that I understand is the lack of dispute resolution means that nobody can get their funds back if they're hacked, for example. We had that recent $10 million USD hack, I believe it was, a week or two ago, and the block producers were able to freeze it with ECAF's help and I think get the money back. So those are the kind of things that would be lost. And that's the main question, is whether we care or whether we want that or not as a whole community. And yeah, go ahead, Perry.
Well, I want to clarify and say that I'm not 100% against arbitration, because there's going to be cases where things need to be arbitrated. The Ricardian contracts themselves can produce errors, and those need to be arbitrated. So I'm not against arbitration as a concept, but what I'm saying is that we should try to set it up so it's minimized, so that when we get this wonderful gentleman named Colin Rule, who has been roped into this impossible job, God bless that guy, who has so much experience, right? We're so lucky to have him. When we get him in there and we present to him the task of dealing with all the possible exceptions that are going to be created, we have minimized the amount of work that he has to do. We've put the best guy in front of it, the best guy in front of the problem, but we've minimized his job. And if we can say that we've created overkill, then we've succeeded. That's just, if he's just sitting there, and he won't be, of course, this is a joke, but if he's just sitting there bored, then that's great news for EOS, right? He's capable, based on what I've seen in the interviews, he's capable of creating a system that is just perfect for EOS. So putting him at that level and allowing him to create the systems, or to have an influence on the systems that can deal with arbitration, is, I think, a perfect combination. So I don't want to say that arbitration should go away completely, but I think we should do everything we can to minimize, in terms of the Constitution, minimize those cases, and then put the best guy to solve them. And then if we do that, then we're showing the DApp developers that we have relatively few exceptions at the base layer, and we have a capable system in place. We're building a capable system to process those exceptions, and I think that's the best of the scenarios. Thank you.
Do you think there's room for Colin Rule and what he's trying to accomplish, even on the most minimal level? Is there room for that in the proposal from Block 1, or do we need to add something?
That's a very good question. Let me take a brief look at that. But I think my recollection is that the recommendation was that the Ricardian contracts, the difference between what the Ricardian contracts say and or the intent of the Ricardian contracts and what the code actually does, is the only thing subject to arbitration. So I think there is, if my recollection is correct, there is a space there, but it's a small space, and all it is did the intent of the Ricardian contract meet the actual code that was executed? And if they're not, then we have a dispute that needs to be addressed, and there needs to be some sort of result with some sort of action. That's my understanding. So I don't think that they're against Ricardian, but I wish someone who was here from Block 1, that would certainly be helpful. But I understand why they're not. So it's kind of up to us to help us along. And I think the idea that many people are putting together constitutions is super. And I look forward to the referendum and what that actual software will look like and how it will present different choices and how that actually works. That's an exciting, that's another exciting development for EOS. I don't know. Do you have any visibility into the referendum app? Have you gotten a peek?
I've not seen a peek yet. I've heard a few different release dates that have been delayed. They're still working to put something out. As of about 3 weeks ago, they were getting pretty close, but I have not seen it yet. It's an important piece of software. I suppose maybe they're testing it at this point. We need to check in with those guys and see what's going on. And that's part of what we're hoping to do probably in this coming week, is to start sort of helping them promote the referendum process, get that first question figured out, what we want to ask with our first referendum question. I think that one of the questions I've seen, it was proposed by Sharif from EOS Dublin, and he was saying that we could just say, we could put out the first question as, should we ratify the first constitution that is in effect, yes or no? And that would probably generate a lot of interest, mostly probably towards the no, because we've seen little support for the current constitution. But at least we'd get the referendum software and process kind of approved by the community with that question. So to be determined on those guys and how that's coming along.
Okay.
And so if you look at Dan's constitution, I should say Block 1's constitution, it's not just Dan's, I suppose. I put the link in the chat. And
V2.
Yeah, the V2 version. So what if we are trying to include Cullen rule? I mean, what do we try to create a new? I mean, they do have. If there's just so, for example, I'll read off the first. I'm going to show my screen here too. I'll read off the first article of this Constitution, of the proposed Block 1 Constitution. If there is a dispute on the intent of code, then intent shall be determined by a supermajority of elected producers or an arbiter mutually agreed to by the parties to the dispute and enacted by the producers. A supermajority may, at their discretion, freeze a contract during an active dispute until such time as a code to fix the contract is available, and so on and so forth. It does sound like they're including an arbiter in this, and therefore the arbiter's job would just be to say, well, was the intent of the code followed by this, or was there an actual bug, and therefore the code was not followed? I've also heard the argument that a scam may have intended to steal money, and therefore the intent of the code was correct, even though they did steal money and harm others. And from what I understand, it looks like that particular case would not be covered by this Constitution. We would just say, yeah, if you don't protect your keys, or if you're not careful with your money, then you may lose it, and there's no recourse for you with this Constitution. But Perry, do you still have your hand up?
Oh, sorry. No, I do not.
Okay, just want to make sure. So I guess the question is, are we happy enough? This is a long first article here, but are we happy enough with something like this, or is this important enough to be number one in the Constitution?
Yeah, I find that quite important, because that, for me, that basically defines the line between. It basically it gives the scope of arbitration.
Yeah, I hear you.
And yeah, that's important.
Justin, did you have something you were going to add? So you turn your camera on there.
No, I'm just reading through it. Sorry.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah. Give you guys a moment to read through it some more.
I suppose in regards to scams, you're right, it doesn't sound like it would be covered here. So maybe the wording could be changed somewhat. Because there's the intent of the code, but there's also what it's purported the code will do. And I'd say, like, if the scammer is purporting that the code does this, it actually does something else, like steal someone's money, that's, yeah, we should try and make it cover those sorts of situations, potentially.
Yeah. Let me look for it. Okay, here we go. Yeah. Does that become a subjective term? This is just an open question. I don't know the answer, but oh yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah. I think that's completely valid at the DAP layer. Of course, we want to address good faith, and we want to address scams, but it really, by adding it to the base layer, you've created an overhead that I don't think we want at the base layer. You create subjectivity, exactly. And that takes arbitration, and that takes lots of resources. And I've heard proposals of appeals courts within the arbitration, and then how many appeals do you get? And now we're back to the thing that we're trying to avoid. We're back to a mess. So I don't think that should be the landscape or the scope of what we're trying to do right here. It's more like instead of building a full, we're, we're building a piece of infrastructure. And I think the, the more human elements of it, the more social elements of it should be dealt with at the DAP layer. And the arbitration should be left for differences in the Ricardian contract and the differences, like internal differences, but also those are driven by contract. Like for example, block producer contract and the arbitrator contract. Those are internal mechanisms of EOS itself. Those are candidates for arbitration. But anything when we start getting outside of EOS, outside of the base layer, and we start to get into what I believe should be the DAP layer, that's when we introduce extra work for the Honorable Mr. Colin Rule, and we add instability to the token, to the EOS ecosystem itself. And so I think our value should be, if you could call it that, should be a design value, should be just absolute minimalism in terms of all overhead, including arbitration and block production and everything. Now, arbitration is largely going to be manual at the beginning. A lot of it will be manual, but as it evolves, it can become automated. And there should be a value to automate that as much as possible, to increase the automation of all of those. That should be some way, that should be some value. And I don't know if that value becomes part of the Constitution or a separate document or where it gets expressed. Maybe just in our deliberations over the Constitution, but it's somewhere we have to kind of come together in terms of what do we value. And once we do that, then it's much easier. Then it'll feel like we're all working in the same direction. Because right now it kind of feels like all the paddles are going in different directions, which is okay at the beginning. That's fine. There's lots of people, lots of discussions. But once we can figure out, once we can get the scope and the value, I think we'll all be paddling in the right direction, or in the same direction. It might not be the right direction, but it'll be the same direction.
I can tell you, at least from the perspective of having seen a few of these calls and some opinions, subjective terms in general have been frowned upon by far majority of the folks who have attended these calls, any kind of subjective terms. And that is to eliminate the amount of work that arbitrators would have to deal with in the long run. Of course, then if we are, the scam DAP may not have any kind of constitution that protects users, obviously. And therefore, the users would have no recourse if they were to have their EOS stolen. So it sounds like you're willing to sacrifice that good faith part of the Constitution in order to save the amount of extra work it would provide or enforce upon.
Well, let's ask ourselves, how did Apple deal with that? They created an ecosystem, and they're only allowed that where they edit the apps. Now that concept goes against the ethos of EOS, to put one gatekeeper. But if we just if somebody creates an app market and with a rating system, and it becomes trusted, it's not required, but everybody knows that that's the best place to get your apps because they go through a vetting process. Then that free market mechanism will fill that need and protect the users. I still think it's valuable not to require that. I mean, that would kind of go against the whole the values I think of most of the people building this thing, which is create a single gatekeeper that decides what apps get loaded. But if someone created one and they created a good one that had a good feedback system and people began to trust it voluntarily, I think that's the best of all the worlds. That's, for me, that's the solution to the scams. And the scams, so the scams won't be able to get through the app market. They won't be approved. That's one way.
Yep.
Warbly is doing such a thing, but they've gone the extreme way, and they've created a sister chain on private consensus, which I think that's too far. I'm not really for that. I don't think that's the direction to go. But if they have to do that temporarily, some people are saying that's the way to do it temporarily. There may be an argument for that. But as far as EOS goes, I don't think that's what EOS is about. There has to be a place where people can freely build without censorship. And unfortunately, that means scams can arise. But we live with the same thing on the internet, right? And we deal with it. And the biggest problem that we've had recently has to do with the centralized, controlled arenas, i.e., Facebook. That's where the issues came up. People, right? So to protect yourself from malware, you choose a virus protection. You can also install some things in your browser that do active monitoring of the internet that protect you. You voluntarily choose that protection. I think that's the answer for me to the scam question.
Makes sense. Yeah, I want to make sure and say hi to Todor. Thank you for coming, Todor. We're having a low-key conversation here about wider, and it's sparking something in my mind too. I mean, so Perry was just talking about how we need to find that balance between, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Perry, what you were saying, but we need to find that balance in terms of how much we want people to protect their own property. So we're not looking to hold their hands when it comes to scams. We don't want to put that in the Constitution, is what you're saying. On the other hand, we do have a lot of grandmas and whoever else we're trying to invite into the blockchain. And I guess if they lose their funds and there's no customer service, we may have a chance of losing them. We may have a harder time gaining adoption. I guess if we're looking at a long-term, what our overarching goals as a community are, if we really want, mass adoption is all we care about, then maybe we do put more work on ourselves, or if we just want to make it a scalable protocol that makes as many dApps as possible, and then hopefully the dApps themselves get grandma in and protect her.
Well, I'm glad you brought up grandma. I'm glad you brought up grandma. Grandma will be protected by dApps. Right. I don't think it's the purview or responsibility or obligation of the base layer to protect grandma. HTTP doesn't protect grandma. So
hopefully grandma never even knows about EOS, ideally.
Exactly. So what she'll know is she'll know an app, a dApp, that her grandkids have set up for her, and she will operate in the confines of that thing, and hopefully that dApp, or hopefully their grandkids are bright enough to give grandma a dApp that has the necessary safeguards, just like a parent would hand to their child an app with the necessary safeguards in place. So I think there's those safeguards, and taking care of grandma is absolutely essential, and it's part of the path to mass adoption. It's really the end of the path when we can get the oldest and youngest on board safely. But it's not. I don't think it's the territory of the base layer to resolve those issues or protect those people. The base layer does it by providing scalability and stability that dApps can build on, and that they can build their own arbitration systems and dispute resolution systems on that are reliable and fast and so on. But it's important. Those things are protecting grandma is important, but it's not important for the EOS Constitution base layer. That's a summary.
And if we're looking at in Toda, Justin, Philip, you guys have any extra thoughts to throw in? Nice. Yeah.
I was thinking about not grandmother user, but grandmother business owner. Do you want to include her as well? What do you think, Perry?
Can you give an example of?
You're talking about hot grandma?
No, I'm just thinking that
I'm not sure I know that one.
Many businesses are kind of afraid to build on blockchain because they don't have a sense of security. They cannot insure themselves because insurance companies cannot assess the risk when there's no human layer at the bottom to ensure that problems can sometimes be fixed.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right, and we shouldn't ignore that. 100% agree with that. But I don't think it should be dealt with at the base layer, or it should be minimized at the base layer. Earlier, I said that we don't want to eliminate arbitration, but we want to minimize its workload and maximize our capacity to process that workload. So grandma that owns a business that wants to create a business on there, she is probably going to be building something within a dApp platform, a dApp which is acting like a platform for small businesses to present their business, which has a bunch of tools already created, easy to use. Has its own constitution, its own arbitration process. It's all soft and fluffy, and it's thought about her and everything that she could possibly need. But at the base layer, it's got to be built more like a telecom, more like the infrastructure of the internet itself. It's got to be just clean and minimalistic, and just keep it to only what we need, and value scalability and value performance, and just keep our judgments and our subjective opinions, the need for them, to a minimum at that layer, so that we can then go to the dApp layer and build on something that's stable, those systems that do address grandma and her business.
Do you, Toda or Justin or anyone have experience, for example, if business insurance is looking into trying to insure a company, would they look down to the protocol layer, or would they just look at the dApp layer that the business is trying to build on top of and say, okay, it looks like that? For example, if we look at PayPal, someone's trying to sell stuff on PayPal, I suppose the insurance would look at PayPal as the protection layer, right? If something goes wrong, if there's some fraud, then PayPal will recoup the costs. As opposed to what Perry's argument is, the HTTP is not going to be reimbursing any costs. They're not doing dispute resolution. It's actually PayPal built on top of everything else. Is that?
Yeah, I think most businesses will be on a dApp layer, like a decentralized Uber or a decentralized eBay type system, and they'll have those protections given by that dApp and their governance layer. I think there's a lot of solutions for the grandma business owner who's actually building from the base layer their own dApp. And one of the things they could do is rent the staked resources instead of owning or the EOS themselves. So yeah, they could use something like Chintai. But I think overall, there's no, like, if we do have arbitration, it should be with the scope of protecting developers, not protecting users, because the users will be protected by that DApp layer eventually. And I feel like a lot of it is a flawed vision that a lot of people have, that, everyone will be utilizing EOS as a token on a number of dApps. And I think going forward, that actually won't be the case. Something like EOS Bet will have its own betting token, or it will use a stable token. And that stable token will have its own governance layer that will add protections for users. I think the whole vision that people will be trading EOS in apps is just completely wrong. EOS is the token of use for developing the dApps themselves. So if we need to have an arbitration layer to protect developers, we should, but just limit it to that scope. And if we can get around that and put protections via the code, we should do that as much as possible and keep it as minimalist as possible.
So what I'm getting from this is that we want to keep arbitration away from the base layer just because that's the easiest way to scale. Is that it?
I think so.
That's what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, but isn't that shifting the problem to the DApp layer? The DApp layer will now have the same problem that wasn't solved at the base layer, and we're saying that it's a difficult problem to solve. So we're just
every DApp is different.
Away. And then who solves that?
I think every DApp has their own needs of what level of protections are needed. And if we do it at the base layer, then we're kind of presuming what the needs are for all dApps. And that's an impossible dilemma, I feel. Every DApp has its own use cases and needs. So I think it's impossible for us to kind of make that judgment at the base layer.
So that's kind of an argument for specialization, as far as I understand that.
Yeah, allowing the dApps to do the specialization themselves.
But we don't want to catch all. When specialization fails, we don't want to catch all. Why don't we want to catch all?
We don't have a catch-all. Do we want a catch-all for the package that doesn't get delivered on somebody's porch? No.
If we want to fix all the problems, I guess. Sorry for interrupting you. Go ahead.
No. That's okay. Yeah. So yeah, I don't think that's what we want at the base layer. I don't think that we want to be able to say that we can fix all the problems. I think what we want to do is place the burden of solving the problem at the right layer. And for me, the right layer for those kinds of problems is the DApp layer. And if we can completely keep it out of the base layer and totally in the DApp layer, then we've done a service. Now that creates a burden for the apps for arbitration. That's true. But it is the correct layer in my eyes. What can we do to help them? Well, we can, as the base layer, we will be creating software to automate the processes of our arbitration. That's going to happen for sure. We all know that. That's going to create code. That's going to create open source code. And there isn't any reason why that open source code couldn't be leveraged at the DApp layer in some form, at least conceptually. And it's possible that if after a while that code becomes so stable that EOS could actually provide a service to the dApps for that portion of the code, where EOS is not actually performing arbitration, but we're assisting in the automation of arbitration. we're giving the DApp services. For example, let's say they want to do their own arbitration, and we give them services that allow them to select to define the attributes of their arbitrator agreement, and that produces a JSON, which they ask all of their arbitrators to submit a matching JSON file, and it creates a scheme of dividing up the workload. And that becomes a service that runs on EOS that isn't deciding cases, is not deciding about that package on the porch, but it's helping the DApp do less work to decide that case about the package on the porch.
And Tudor, it sounds like you may have a slightly different opinion as to. I'd like to hear your thoughts as well on just overarching. Do we have kind of an arbitration base layer arbitration on the base layer? Is it workable? What are your overarching thoughts?
I think we need a way to enforce rules on the base layer, but I don't necessarily agree that it needs to be called arbitration or to even resemble arbitration. That's what we've been saying so far that we need, because that's what we thought that we can borrow from the real world. But I think actually EOS is a platform. It's kind of a service provider, and service providers usually they don't have a constitution because they're not a nation, they have terms of use. So when terms of use for a service provider are broken, you don't go to an arbitrator for that. You usually have some kind of abuse department with service providers that handle such cases much faster than arbitrators do, and much more efficiently, I would say. But then again, this is centralized, so I'm not sure how we can decentralize that. But I think that we should work towards that instead of arbitration if we want to borrow something from the old best practices, so to say. And that would, in my opinion, scale much better than what we're trying right now. So yeah, I think we need some kind of way to enforce the rules at the base layer, because if we don't have that, what's going to happen is that, at least in my opinion, some bad things are going to happen and problems are going to need to be fixed at the base layer. And since there's no structure in place, some kind of structure will self-select itself, and we're going to have another Bitcoin or Ethereum. So I think we better set up a structure ourselves before that happens, because it would be transparent and accountable instead of some kind of a shadow government. I agree it has to be minimalistic, but I think there needs to be something. And I think that, well, basically the immutability that is promised to us is kind of an illusion, and there's always humans behind the machines that produce the blocks and agree on the rules. So we need to acknowledge that. We can't say that this is automation because it's not real automation. It's actually humans behind everything. So that's basically my thoughts on this.
Are you saying that arbitrators, or whatever the body ends up being, not necessarily arbitrators, but is this the body that kind of helps keep the block producers in check? If we're assuming that, for example, if there is a collusion issue that needs to be looked into and needs to be a dispute resolution so basically, let's just put an example out. Say a developer is complaining about the block producers colluding, and the developer wants some kind of recourse about that. Is that what you're saying is the kind of arbitration layer that you would be looking for on the base layer, more so than a consumer-facing one?
Not only the block producers. The block producers just the most likely candidate to to self-select themselves as the governing body in the absence of an established governing body. But it could be some other participant in the network as well. Could be the developer, could be just some influential user or something. We don't know. I mean, it's a power vacuum. Someone will fill it up, in my opinion.
Sure. Okay. And going back, so our original goal here was, and we'll do this maybe about 15 more minutes, and then we'll start wrapping up. But the original goal here was to kind of envision what this small group's larger goals are, which it sounds like we want minimal subjective terms. We want minimal arbitration on the base layer. And we want to kind of hone everything into what would be our first article of our proposed constitution. I know we've looked at the Block 1 constitution proposal. We examined their first article, which is a pretty good first article. You know, the very first thing that someone sees. I'll post it in the chat here. All about the dispute on the intent of code. Question is, do we need to, I'll let you guys read it for a moment, if you haven't already.
You're talking about number 1 again, or number 2?
Number 1 of the Block 1
Okay.
version.
The part that I divert on is the fee. I'm of the mind that the fee should be paid by through the 5%, a portion of the 5%. So I've made a proposal on that, and I know you've read it, Kevin, but I have kind of a different view. I don't want to take up this meeting with my proposal, but that's one part I don't quite concur with, is that they pay directly for their arbitration, the parties to the dispute. But I don't know. I guess I could be persuaded a different way, possibly. But that's how I feel at this moment. Is that it should come out of a general fund and have candidate rules. Go ahead. So that would be my only difference with that paragraph.
Yeah, and it is saying that the producers are the ones who would charge the fee. So that again leads to that power vacuum that Todor was talking about, where the producers could charge an enormous fee if there's something that might be going against them. Possibly, I'm not saying this could happen, but if there is a dispute that might be brought up against block producers, maybe they charge, that'll be 20,000 EOS to bring up this dispute, which may or may not be looked at.
Right. That's their way of voting, and no one gave them the power to vote that way. Their power is not to execute code, to execute or not to execute. That's their only power. And if they don't execute code that the voting public deems that they should be executing, then they get voted out. And yeah, so I guess they could charge more money, and that would be essentially the same thing. But they could just not execute any decisions by the arbitration. Same deal.
Any other thoughts about the first part? So if there was a dispute on the intent of code, and there's also that question, Todor, you might have missed this earlier as well. We talked about, we also looked at the version 3 proposal from Amsterdam. They put out their version, and Philip pointed out that they have a good faith clause in there. I'll show my screen so you can see it. But basically, the intent of code version 2 proposal, it does not really protect against scams necessarily, because a scam site may very much intended to steal the money, and therefore there will be enough people, possibly some people who, even if it clearly says we're going to steal your money, they might still click it and then want some recourse, for example. So here's the part that Philip showed us. All parties are free to use EOS as they please, providing they act in good faith, don't infringe on the rights of others, and comply with this charter. And there's a note down here about good faith, how it's defined. You can let you take a look.
Yeah, I think good faith is a very good addition. It's kind of a fuzzy rule that is easy for us to understand.
A little bit subjective, but not enough, because it is defined here, and most people can understand that stealing is not good faith.
What I'm not sure I like is the fact that producers are the ones who both execute and decide. There's no separation of powers here. And that's a very good practice that we should borrow. We should have some separation of powers.
Absolutely agree with that.
Agree, yeah.
For me, the good faith is it's of course everybody wants good faith, but because it's subjective, I don't think it has a place at the base layer.
Let's take a little vote, because so good faith, Harry's saying no, something like that should not be in the base layer. What does everybody else think about something like that?
I think it's too subjective, personally.
Any thoughts there, Todor? What do you?
Well, yeah, of course it's subjective, but what isn't subjective really, other than math?
Todor, may I ask you something?
Yeah,
I don't
sure.
I don't know how your role in the ecosystem, but are you a dApp developer?
No.
Do you want to be? Are you involved in any way in a dApp being developed?
Well, a little bit, I guess. I am a part of Warbly right now, since recently.
Okay.
So kind of.
So, yeah, I mean, it would reduce Warbly's workload if EOS solved all the arbitration issues. There's no question about it.
Are you looking for an ulterior motive?
I'm working for mankind. No, I'm not suggesting it's an alternative motive. Not at all. No, there's nothing wrong with working for a dApp. Absolutely not. But it makes sense why if I was creating a dApp right now, and I may sometime in the future create a dApp, but if I was doing that right now, and I wanted to get in the market because people are just on fire to create dApps right now on EOS. If I wanted to do that, I would love to have the arbitration issue just resolved and handed to me. Awesome. That would be amazing. Thank you. But it's not the right place. It's not the right place for it. So that it's by putting it there where I think will cause more problems than we solve.
I think it's an illusion to believe that we can have a fully automated base layer that's immutable and does not depend on any subjectivity. I think there's always going to be subjectivity. The way that complete decentralization works in Bitcoin is because it's absolutely objective. It's based on pure math calculations. And when you have voting, though, you cannot expect to have such unanimous agreement. Voting will always be, there is always going to be some minority. And that's not the same thing. It's not the same thing as every machine agreeing to the same thing other than bad actors. We're going to have disagreements here without being bad actors. So there's always going to be subjectivity at the base layer with the DPoS consensus, because it's not based on objective criteria. It's based on voting. So you cannot run away from subjectivity on EOS. So that's why I think we need, especially on a DPoS chain, a way to enforce rules at the base layer.
Oh, I'm not arguing against the ability to enforce rules or arbitrate or any of that. I'm suggesting just minimizing it, just minimizing it, and that's why I said that good faith may not be the right place for good faith at the base layer. Now, if somebody wants to put good faith in their own constitution as a DApp, then they can put that in there as a value that we honor people that show good faith, and our arbiters, in quote, our arbiters will value what they deem as good faith, and fine, that's fine. That's completely within their right to do that. But I don't think that on the base layer we should be inserting that when we don't have to. We just and we're going to have arbitrators. I believe that we should have arbitration because we're going to have disputes, and we're not blockchain and we're not Ethereum because we're not because we have a different form of consensus. But we want to minimize that as much as possible. We want to reduce that surface area as much as possible.
And Philip, go ahead, Philip.
That's a good question. I've thought about that. It could be a separate document. It's possible. Maybe a separate section. And what is the difference between an article in the Constitution and some form of value that's expressed? Right? Why is that different? Why are we adding it? Why is it different? And how does it? And the answer to that might be that the articles are supposed to deal with, this is how we execute, this is how the system is supposed to operate. And the values are supposed to guide us for how we're going to create EOS system in the future. So one of them, the articles are dealing with the now, the here and now. How do we process and respond to the here and now? And the values respond to how do we design for the future, right? And it could be a separate section of the same document. Maybe it's a separate document unto itself. Maybe we create the equivalent of a Bill of Rights, an EOS user Bill of Rights. That's possible, but it's not. There's nothing enforcement in there, and I'm hesitant to even suggest that because there's nothing enforceable. But and also what Block One has, the leadership that Block One has shown up to now, I personally have been in alignment with for the most part. So I haven't really felt a need for a separate document, Bill of Rights or values. It's a very good question. Do we, and how does that play into the whole open source paradigm? Right now, Block One is open sourcing code and just putting it out there, and block producers are choosing whether to run it or not. Maybe that's enough, right? If you can get it on the GitHub, on that branch, if you can get your code on that branch, then we don't need design values. But I don't know. So it's a good question. I kind of like the idea of, this is what we value. As long, I guess I like that idea as long as I am in agreement with it. That's the hard part. That's the hard part.
Won't be everybody in agreement no matter what we do. So we have just about 5 more minutes here. And so to sort of go back and summarize here, I'll show you what I have pulled up. So I've copied over. Excuse my dog in the background; she may make some noise here. But so here's the version 2, article 1. Excuse me there. Hang on one second. So what I'm kind of hearing is. Sorry, guys. There's a dog outside. That's exciting stuff. So what we're getting at here is that we don't want to necessarily protect the consumer. We're not looking to have all kinds of stolen and lost funds. We're looking to push that to the DApp layer is the general consensus here so far. We are looking for some kind of balance of power, number one, for the block producers and developers. So what I'm hearing is if we look at this part here, shall be determined by a supermajority of elected producers. I'm seeing that Toter especially is recommending we eliminate this, where it would say, shall be determined by an arbiter, usually agreed to by the parties to the dispute, and then enacted by the producers. Is that kind of what you're getting at, Toto?
I'm not sure if this aligns with the rest of the whole proposal. Where does that arbiter come from here? That's not really defined, I think.
Yeah, I agree. The rest of it would have to be rewritten as well. This is just sort of a sample. If it were to be a new proposal, and assuming that we were to define those terms later on, and this is just sort of a rough draft idea, is what I'm so, and also, yeah. So it's the arbiter that we, yeah. I'll get your thoughts on that in terms of, are we trying to eliminate the producers from making those decisions, or trying to determine whether the intent of the code was actually to steal the money or to act maliciously, or if it was just a bug that they need to fix. Are the block producers deciding that, or is it an arbitration body or some kind of other body deciding, like a developer union that decides whether the intent of the code was actually executed correctly?
Well, if we try to mimic the standard separation of powers between executive, judicial, and legislative, obviously the producer are the executive power. They're the only ones that can implement anything. That they're like the army. They're the ones with the only real power. So that leaves the other two powers, and I think the community could serve as the legislative power, because that's what we should have. Users say that's what we want, and then that's what are the rules that we make.
Yeah,
I guess that makes sense to me, at least. And then we need another body, neither the community nor the block producers, to enact the third power. And I think it has to be selected in a different way than block producers, or we would have the same thing, kind of, a possibility for collusion, or just twisting the whole idea of separation of powers. I'm not sure what this way for selecting this body should be, because that's the hard part, obviously. Yeah. There have been different proposals, but I really think we should work towards that, finding out a good way to have a third body, a third power, so that we can borrow that good practice from the real world.
Yeah, go ahead. Was it Philip who wanted to speak? So an independent, non-affiliated auditing group. Yeah, it's a tough argument. It's a tough decision / problem to try and solve. We won't have time, obviously, to solve that now in terms of how that body would be elected, or not elected, but appointed, or however you want to go about it. I guess the broader theme, having the balance of power, does everybody kind of agree with that, with what Toto was saying?
Yeah, I can generally agree with that, definitely.
Meaning that we have to have some counterbalance to block producer power.
Yeah, I think that's the basic.
And in this case, in the form of a judicial party of some form. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Exactly how that manifests is another question, but yeah, we absolutely need a counterbalance to block producer power, and I believe block producer should just be executing and only deciding, do I run the software or not? Yeah.
Which points out this second sentence would have to be significantly modified, because it says a supermajority, and it's referring to the block producers, may at their discretion freeze a contract during an active dispute until such time as a code. So obviously we're thinking that the third party in this balance of power would be the one that would make the decision for that freeze to happen. Kind of what's happening now. The ECAF issues the blacklist or the freeze order. So the exact wording is, let's see, a supermajority. And this is just rough wording, obviously, but this arbitration, this issue an order to freeze. Yeah. And the parties to the dispute must produce proposed replacement code. So then the second part we discussed for a bit, talking about charging a reasonable fee, and or placing other reasonable requirements on the parties to the dispute. Supermajority is defined as 2/3 plus 1. So they're talking about the producers charging this fee. A couple of you guys have mentioned possibly having the worker proposal cover these fees. Is that the general consensus in this group, that we would want independent funding provided by the blockchain?
Yes.
Yes, I also think so. It's kind of selective treatment if we don't do that.
Okay. So who would decide that fee? Obviously this judicial branch would be paid by this fee. I guess who is deciding the fee? That's another tough question. We'll have to be discussed for a while, but we'll just leave it like this for now. This, as I said, it's a very rough draft. Just trying to get sort of the overarching themes that we're trying to represent as a group. Supermajority is referred to. They're just talking about block producers, which we are not. Block producers, they execute an order from a supermajority.
I don't think it necessarily has to be a fee model. It just needs to have a reliable way of continuously enforcing the rules, because that's what we need. It doesn't always have to be a dispute.
So that a continuous funding for that judicial body in whatever shape it takes.
Yeah, I'm just objecting to the word fee, because that implies a certain model, and we can have a different model.
That's a good point. Blockchain's common fund will cover costs of there you go. Yeah. Perfect word. Yeah. In our place. Okay, so this doesn't make any sense now. Let's see. Compensate the judicial body. let's see, the second part doesn't make any sense here, but we'll just leave it short like that for now. Again, just trying to cover the overarching themes that we represent. So the block producers may execute the order from the judicial body with a supermajority. Ricardian contractual terms that cannot be enforced by properly functioning code are beyond the scope of the producers, which we're changing to judicial body, I believe. So that's something I've actually seen. I think it's EOS New York has mentioned they do not support, and probably a couple other block producers don't support this proposal from Block 1 because it does, as Todor said, it just puts all the power right into the hands of the block producers. And then you just have the executive body and the legislative body. You don't have that third head in the balance of power. And therefore it's far easier for a bad actor to corrupt the system without any kind of balance of power. So regarding contractual terms that cannot be enforced, any objections to this last sentence? Enforced by properly functioning code. So I think in my mind, this last sentence is saying that consumer claims are not covered, basically. The whole, I lost my funds because I lost my private key or I did something dumb. This last sentence says you're not covered.
Right. Yeah. I agree with that. That's wise. Yeah. That's basically saying let's do it. Let's take care of that at the DApp layer. Mm-hmm.
Cool. So I think we have it in terms of what this group thinks overall. I think we have kind of a real basic, obviously, Article 1 as to what would make more sense. We are kind of rejecting part of what Dan/Block 1's proposal is saying. So it does sound like we need some kind of a version 3 written up. I'll just go ahead and copy and paste this into the Zoom chat so you can keep it. And so the main point, the Korean/English group yesterday, I couldn't believe it. They went ahead and they drafted an entire constitution after the call. And so now they put out the proposal and there's a bunch of them working on revising it now. So, and that's all this exercise is an attempt to do, is get people thinking about, okay, what does the broader group want? What is the intent? And now that we sort of know that, we can hone in on what the rest of it, because as we know with this first article, we need to decide how is the judicial body, how is that body elected/appointed? How does all that work? Those can now be honed in on more, that we kind of have a wider idea. And the Korean Constitution version hopefully will be translated into English soon so that we can start looking into it with them and then help them revise with what we have as well. So
I'm excited to see all the different versions that are coming in, and I expect that the best is going to be a combination of a lot of them. That's what I think. There's going to be a lot of good ideas, I think, and really appreciate, Kevin, you doing this. You put yourself in a difficult spot every time you get into these meetings, so I appreciate it. Do a good
Thanks,
job.
Barry. And I agree with you too about this will be a conglomerate probably of a whole bunch of different Constitution offerings that people put out. We'll see what comes out, but I think it will be kind of a Frankenstein Constitution.
Well, hopefully we'll boil it down to the essence of what needs to happen. Where can we find that? Where will we be able to find it, an English translation of that?
So we'll put it up on the Medium blog, and also they'll have it translated on their Google Doc. It'll probably come sometime next week because they're still working on it, revising some more.
Who's they?
Korean community for what they're working on.
Do you mean EOS Korea? Is there an EOS Korea?
There's an EOS SIS, and actually I think we may have Damien with Acro EOS is very active with translating, so he may be the one who actually translates. Turns into
Okay,
English.
so we'll watch the Alliance webpage for that, I guess.
Yeah, we'll get it up probably on the Medium blog, but we'll get it up and post it.
Okay. All right.
So, thanks. Thanks, guys. Yeah, any final thoughts from anyone before we go? So, thank you guys as always. Go ahead, Justin. Yep.
I was just going to say, although I agree with the article with kind of drawn up, or that in a general sense, I do worry that if we don't have a way to execute what we want, maybe we have to pull it back a bit to what we can actually achieve now. Like, for instance, having the second body, if we don't have a method that is better than how we elect block producers, the reality is that having that second body actually won't work. So that might be why block one, has limited kind of the scope so much, is because until we have that method of electing another body that can operate outside the block producers, you just can't do it. So maybe we need to accept, a high level of limitation for now, until we have things like identity, and then maybe you can have a single vote per person, and that will elect that actual judicial body that is actually outside of the block producers.
I've been resisting from mentioning it, but let me ask you: have you read the article that I wrote, Justin? Is it Justin?
Yes, not yet, but I'll definitely take a look at it if you post the link. Or
I will.
yeah.
I will post it. Yeah. It basically, the suggestion that I've made is to add arbiters to DPOS and to create a pool of arbiters, just like we have a pool of block producers, and vote on that pool, just like we vote for block producers, and basically apply the same DPOS mechanism that yields all of this amazing work product from all of these block producers, to apply that same thing to arbitration. And we pay them in a similar way. Now, they would also get part of, they would get an income stream similar to block producers, and they would be motivated that way, and they would ultimately be, their incentives would ultimately be aligned with voters. So that's my proposal, and that's kind of the missing piece that in my mind, I'm seeing to Article 1 that we don't have, is that the definition of that, and that would kind of fill in, I think, some of the questions about how do we decide who the arbitrators are? Well, we create a pool and we let the voters decide. That's the answer. In my eyes, that's the answer. And I'll post that. I'll post that link here.
I think Philip might have beat you to it. The vested hand article. You just posted it up in the chat there.
Let me see. Let me take a look. That's it. Well, okay. That's the follow-on article. There's actually another one. That's kind of the last of a trilogy. Number 2 is a different one. Let me go to that one, and I'll post that one.
If I may, just a quick comment then.
Sure.
Generally, this makes sense, but I'm a bit worried that being an arbiter becomes more of a political thing, just like block producers are kind of political right now.
Yeah.
They have to campaign for votes, which impedes their ability to be independent. So maybe, what if instead of that, we kind of select a body that in turn selects arbitrators, to just make it a little more easy on the arbitrators to feel at ease to provide independent judgments.
And who makes that selection?
Well, the community, just like you suggested, the community votes for a body that in turn convenes or holds a meeting or has an internal process to select actual arbitrators.
Oh, okay. No, that's that seems to be within what I've said. I'm not suggesting that individuals, specific persons are elected. I'm saying arbitration firms like block production firms, companies, entities like EOS New York and EOS 42 and EOS Aloha, whatever, that they are selected. And then of course they have their own, arbitration firms would have their own arbitrators, but the firms themselves would be the ones that would be receiving the funds and so on. So yeah, I think I agree with what you're saying. It shouldn't be individuals. You shouldn't be selecting individual people, but companies, groups of people. And I just posted the article, EOS Joy and the radical proposal for the separation of powers. That's the one that kind of basically says we need to separate the powers of arbitration from block production, and we also need to create another power, which is that of a scribe. You can call it whatever you want. It doesn't really matter, but it's essentially the equivalent of what we have in the United States called C-SPAN. I don't know if everybody's familiar with C-SPAN, but C-SPAN is like a public affairs neutral party, and it serves to document and facilitate the deliberations of our government bodies. And I think there's a role for that in EOS, an important role, an extremely important role, because ultimately what we're designing here, even if we just keep it to block production, is we're creating a system that is dependent on voters being informed and educated as much as possible. That's what's going to inform healthy voting. So what I'm suggesting is that we put arbitrators in similar candidate pools, vote for them, and now we have a real need for information about what's going on inside this blockchain, and that's where the scribes come in, and that's what EOS Alliance has done. And in fact, Kevin right here, he's doing it right now. He's facilitating a discussion about how to operate, we're deliberating about how to make this thing work. And I think that role itself needs to be also under the control of voters, under the influence of voters, so that voters can downvote or upvote these scribes, or let's call them facilitators. And if they do a good job, because we need them, and we're going to need more than just one of them. This thing is going to grow, and arbitration cases are going to grow, and people are going to be curious as to what's going on. There's going to be tons of money at stake, and people are going to want to know, and they're going to say, wait a second, I can't see what's going on. Whoa, that can't be.
Yeah.
And so there's going to be this need for information and light. And I think that all three pillars of power, all three of these, the block producers, the arbiters, and the scribes, the ones that are recording it and facilitating all of this, including translation, there's all kinds of things that they can do, but all of it neutral. The scribe is neutral. So all three of these things working together, all of them under the influence of voting, I think that's the answer.
Yeah, and Barry, you kind of nailed it too. I mean, the Alliance obviously kind of like C-SPAN in this case, and we're running right up on our time limit here. I see that Philip raised his hand, so I want to make sure he gets say there.
Okay, thank you. There's no guarantees, as there's no guarantees of block producers. But if they can be voted out, they're incentivized not to do that. And then you also have, as you always do in all cases, the regular media. So the regular media, bloggers, vloggers, newspapers, Bloomberg, CNBC, everybody is going to be watching, and they'll be keeping and putting in check the scribes and everybody. So the press, which is the same press that is mentioned in the U.S. Constitution and in many constitutions around the world, will have its role to keep in check the scribes, the internal scribes, which are supposed to be neutral, and everybody else as well, but definitely the neutral press.
And I see that, hey, Mary, I see you raise your hand there. Hi.
Yeah, thanks for letting me be a fly on the wall and for putting this together and sharing your thoughts and insights and proposals. Is it possible, or has anybody proposed the possibility of block producers not being able to vote for one another in light of this whole collusion hoobie thing that's being suggested is going on?
I think the answer is not really. And part of it is because it's expected that the block producers will just vote for themselves. And it's kind of a tough question. I don't know if there's a way to really prevent that, though, because the block producers could just move their funds to a different wallet, an anonymous wallet, and then vote for themselves from there. There's so many ways around it. It's one of those design problems or issues that need to be solved in terms of having unique identity on the blockchain, which has not been solved yet. And once we have that unique identity, we can say, okay, well, now this person obviously is trying to use a shell account to vote for themselves with the block producer. So maybe down the line, it could be implemented. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, anyone else here who has seen differently. But I don't think it's been seriously considered just because it's very hard or impossible to implement right now.
It'd be nice if the exchanges were not allowed to vote and if the block producers were not allowed to vote for each other. I mean, they're voting on a lot of other things, but that was just my question. Thanks for listening.
That's a good question, and I agree with what Kevin has said. Is that it's all tied to identity, and that's what block one appears to be working on.
Yeah, I'm anxiously awaiting that one.
Yeah, I think everybody is solve a lot of issues that we can hopefully move forward. Just like what you said, move forward on important things that we need to solve after that comes up. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up, guys. Thank you very much for coming in and discussing this. It's been fun. I enjoyed talking to you guys.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Cheers, Kevin. Great work.
See ya.
Bye-bye.